this rolling. All right. Well, it's good to be back with you again this morning, and it's good to see your faces, whether you're on Zoom or whether you are in person with us this morning. Thanks so much for being with us and joining us for this time together. You did, if you're here in the room, you got this sheet of paper when you came in, and I'll talk more about this at the end of the service. So just go ahead and hold on to that. But this morning, we're continuing in our series that we've been in, prior to Easter and Palm Sunday. We've been in this series entitled really going through the Good and Beautiful God. It's really going through there's a book called The Good and Beautiful God. And we've been going through the different aspects of that book together and talking through just some different realities of the truth of who God is, and really not just to know about God, but it's really, this is the God that Jesus knew. This is the God that Jesus shows us who God is, and he shows us exactly, what our lives are to look like in relation to that. And so we've really had this goal to want to know the God that Jesus knows, and we've been in some ways challenged by having our narratives, our story about God, our understanding about God challenged in some different ways, because we all kind of grew up with different narratives, different things about God, different ways we see God that are sometimes formed by tradition or bad experiences, but aren't really formed by the Bible. Hopefully they're formed by the Bible, but a lot of times they're not. A lot of times they're formed by other cultural things. And so we've talked about things about God being for us and not against us. We've talked about the reality that God is a good God, that God is a trustworthy God, that he is generous, and that really at the core, God is the perfect embodiment of love. That actually anything that God does comes from this perfect agape love. It kind of motivates and drives him. He in and of himself is the very being of love, the very expression of love. And so anytime we experience or receive love, or we're able to express love to other people, and in some way we are actually receiving or giving God away, right? That's kind of an interesting concept to understand how God is very much tied in to the very existence of love itself. Today we're going to talk about God being a holy God, that God is holy. And there are many passages that we could look at this morning to talk about how God is holy, or talk about the holiness of God. And in this being a Nazarene church, some of you are probably well versed in the holiness tradition, or talking about God's holiness. This morning, what we're going to look at is in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 15 and 16. We're just going to look at two verses that are really kind of set the stage for what we're looking at this morning. 1 Peter 1, verses 15 and 16. But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in everything, or in all that you do. For it is written, be holy because I am holy. Now, just to give some context a little bit here with this, that this reference from 1 Peter, when it's in quotations here, be holy because I am holy, is really a reference to several places in the book of Leviticus, in the Old Testament law. So Peter is bringing this back up. He's telling his people here, you're aware of this reality of being holy, be holy because I am holy, because this is something that Jewish individuals would have understood very clearly. It was a part of the law. And so what we see from this passage very clearly are two things. One is that God is a holy God. God is holy, and we are called to be holy people. That's kind of it's what Paul is really communicating to us here in this passage. Really simple in that way, but in many ways very complex in terms of understanding what it really means. Now, I want us to remember the term, and we've said this before too, remember the term replication. Replication. What we see in God, we see in Jesus. Jesus shows us God. And so what we see Jesus do, what we see is true of God. As followers of Jesus, we need to understand that we are called to replicate that which we see, right? That which we see in Jesus. A disciple is one who lives like their teacher, their master, the one they follow, right? And so that for us as Christians is Jesus. And so if God is holy, then that means that Jesus is holy. And if Jesus is holy, that means that we are called to be holy people, because that's what Jesus was. And we should expect that this is quite possible, that it is actually very possible for us to live holy lives, to be holy people. But in order for us to fully understand what it means to be holy ourselves and to live holy lives, we have to look to God and to Jesus to really understand holiness from their definition and their practice, not our own, right? We need to look at what Jesus does, what he teaches, how he lives, and then define what it means to be holy based on his teachings and actions, not on something else, not something else that we develop on our own. Because let's be honest, that there's a lot of baggage. We can carry a lot of baggage around us as it's related to this concept of God being a holy God and our call to be holy people. There's a lot of baggage that can be carried around in relation to this. For example, when we say God is holy, that might create a lot of varied responses in us as people. In one respect, from a positive perspective, we might hear that and we may say, well, that means that God is perfect and that God is pure and God is without sin and God is complete and God is otherworldly. He manifests and lives in perfect love. Or on the flip side, when we use that phrase, God is holy, we may come from a little bit more of a negative perspective, and we may look at it and say, well, that really means to me that God is untouchable, right? Or God is distant, or God is unapproachable because he's so otherworldly, like he's so perfect and I am not. And so it might even create this view of God, which is rooted in kind of this idea of God's aloofness or his disappointment in us, because, kind of sitting up there in heaven with his arms crossed and looking at us and saying, I'm holy and you're not, and too bad. Or, come on, man, do better than that, right? You're not doing so great. Like you need to have better actions, better behaviors. And so that's something we can have a variety. What I'm saying, we can have a lot of baggage when we talk about God's holiness. It can come from all different angles, right? It can even get worse when we try to ascribe holiness to a person or talk about people as being holy. Like if I'm to stand up here today and preach and I should say, you should be more like me. I am holy. I am perfect. I am righteous. Like if I were to say that, you might get up, turn around and walk out of the building and never come back. Right? Because that smugness, maybe that sense of arrogance, like this idea that like, oh, you're like holier than thou, like you have it all put together, right? You don't make mistakes. And so then you're sitting in judgment over someone else. And so you might see me as arrogant or smug or judgmental and self-centered if I were to kind of say, hey, look at me, model your life after me because I'm holy. And so I think it's pretty safe to say that the words holy or holiness come with this baggage. And it's because a lot of times we've thought about it or we've tried to understand it from a negative perspective, or we've talked about it from a, that person is with a holier than thou kind of way of looking at things. Or maybe our narrative about God has been a bit wrong. It hasn't been right in terms of understanding what it means to be holy to God. And so it's super important that we need to let God define holiness for us. And we need to understand not just how he defines it, but we need to understand what is God's holiness, because it's only after understanding God's holiness that we will be able to understand what does it look like for you and I to live these lives that 1 Peter talks about, that we are to be holy just as God is holy. Okay, so look with me again at that portion of that verse in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 15. But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. Again, God is holy, and we're called to be holy as well. And again, when you look at us talking about God, I don't want you to think about God the Father. I want you to, when we use the word God being holy, I want you to think Jesus, right? Jesus is God. Jesus shows us God. So that sometimes can help us as human beings to actually personalize this a bit more, right? Look at Jesus. Jesus will show us, okay? So for a moment, let me back up for just a second and define holiness, or what it means to be holy for a minute, just to understand and unpack that word, okay? So the Hebrew word for holy is the word kadesh, okay? And it means, this is what the word for holy means, or holiness means. It means apartness. It means set apartness. It means separateness, or it means sacredness, right? Those are kind of the words that are behind this word holy in the Hebrew scriptures. It doesn't really mean perfect in our English understanding of the word perfect. You know, because when we talk about being perfect in our understanding from an English language, what we're talking about is that means that we're never wrong, that we're always right, and we never make any mistakes, right? That's what it means to be perfect. That's how we understand it. But holiness doesn't carries a bit of a different nuance to it than that, and a different understanding than how our cultural understanding of perfection kind of gets wrapped up into it. Really, the irony is that the person who would stand up and claim that I am holy and that you're wrong is actually behaving quite the opposite. This is the irony, quite the opposite of a holy person, somebody who would live, how someone would operate who is living and pursuing a life of holiness before God. And so because these words in our context create a sense of aloofness and arrogance, I want to suggest that we use a little bit different word this morning as we talk about this. And that word that we're going to use is different. I'm going to use the word different. This is a word that we've grown to appreciate and understand in our culture today. It doesn't hold the same, let me just clarify, it doesn't hold the same weight as holiness. It doesn't perfectly translate in its meaning, but it will help us. It'll help us better understand what we're getting at here when we talk about God being holy and our call to be holy people. And so if you look at this passage through that lens, look at this verse here. This is another way to look at it. Just as he who has called you is different, so be different in all you do. Okay, that might help us a little bit more understand what Peter is getting at here in this passage, and ultimately what Moses writes and teaches us in Leviticus. And so what I want to claim, or want to share with you in relation to this, is that being holy means that as people, this is really important. Being holy means that as people, we are holy, like with an HWOOLL, holy, like completely. Like we are completely different people. But that difference is characterized by how we are driven by agape love. I want you to understand that. Being holy means that you and I are holy, WHOLLY. We're completely holy, that kind of holy, different, and we're driven, and that difference comes out of being driven by God's agape love and how we live our lives. And so how can I make that claim? Well, this is what we see in Jesus. This is how Jesus lives as a holy person. Now, again, if we've been talking about Jesus, that Jesus really shows us who God is, and if God is holy, then Jesus must be holy. And so Jesus then again gives us this picture to see what does it mean to be holy. Do we see Jesus as judgmental, holier than thou, waiting for us to mess up so he can stick it to us? No, we don't see him behaving that way, right? He actually fights with and combats with the powerful religious authorities of the day who were operating this way. They saw themselves as holy, as perfect, pushing other people down, and Jesus calls them hypocrites. He says, you basically missed the whole point. Because they were not operating, their actions were not driven by divine agape love. Their actions were driven by self-centeredness, power, and self-sufficiency, which is antithetical to what it means to be living as a holy person as modeled after the life of Jesus. And so we see Jesus as a very different individual who is driven and motivated by agape love. I would say that our ability to be holy is directly tied to our ability to live a life of agape love. Let me just say that again. Our ability as followers of Jesus is directly tied to our ability to live a life of agape love. Not by keeping a bunch of rules, which is what in some contexts we've taught what it means to be holy. We've been told it means to be holy by all the things you don't do, so that you can achieve some sense of being seen as holy because you don't do the bad things, right? Instead, I would say that holiness is driven by and is motivated by our ability to live a holistic life of agape love all of the time. And when I talk about agape love, I'm not talking about fleeting emotional love. I'm talking about God's love, which is irrational, unconditional, is considerate of all people. It is completely selflessly oriented, right? It is given over in love and compassion to all people, regardless of what they do to us. This is the love of God, right? That is what agape love is. It's very different than our expressions of human love today, right? And how we understand love. And so when we look at Jesus, we see Jesus as a holy person who is driven and motivated by agape, God's agape divine love, and everything that he does, everything. And so what I want to look at this morning is I want to just look at three different pieces to this. I know I've taken quite a bit of time to set this part up, but I want to look at three different pieces that will help us see how Jesus practically lived a holy life. What did holiness look like for Jesus? When we say Jesus is holy, what do we look at in his life to say that's a marker, an identifier of Jesus living a holy life? And the first thing, and I'm going to steal from a book that I've read in the past. It's a book I was meaning to bring it down here to share it with you. It's a book by Trevor Hudson. It's called Discovering Our Spiritual Identity. It's a fantastic book. I'd highly recommend it. It's again, it's Trevor Hudson, Discovering Our Spiritual Identity. And I'm going to steal from some stuff from his book on this because I think it's really good. The first thing that we see in Jesus in terms of how he lives his life as a holy individual is that throughout his early life, Jesus is his own person. Let me unpack this a little bit so it doesn't seem like overly like psychological, okay? Jesus was his own person. Trevor Hudson in his book says, Jesus is the same person inside and outside. He never wears masks. Interesting, right? He never wears masks, and he is always his real and true self. Okay, so, but what does this mean? What does it mean to live in your real self, to be your true person, your true self? Well, in order to do this, we have to understand that there's two ways that we can live as people. We can live according to the true self, and we can live according to the false self in our lives. So I want you to consider these examples to help understand what this looks like. Living according to the true self or the false self. To live according to your true self is to live in such a way that is in line with your true identity as a beloved child of God. But to live according to your false self is to attempt to live, as many of us do daily, out of our sin and unhealthy nature. Not just specific actions, but as a general way of seeing the world. When you feel angry, tense, upset, frustrated about somebody doing something to you that's wrong, and that agitates you and brings up feelings of hostility in you, that is a sign of the false self creeping its head, wanting to maintain control, rights, and authority for your own life. That's an example. It's subtle and it's pervasive in all of our lives. But Jesus calls us to live in a quite different pattern of operation, very different way. Let me give you a couple of examples of this in the scriptures, even of people living according to the false self. Look at Peter. So Peter, when he denied Christ, what was going on for Peter? Well, he's afraid. He's just seen Jesus taken away, right? He's afraid. He's afraid of his own suffering, but more so, that's why I love the video renditions of when they put it on screen and they show you Peter denying Christ. He's more so afraid of the scorn, the ridicule, the loss of acceptance, the being looked at as insufficient or as as less than by his peers, by the crowd around him. And so this is a biblical example of living according to the false self. Peter was concerned not about Jesus in that place. He was concerned with his own well-being and what other people thought about him. That's false self-living. Or consider when some of the disciples argued who would be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. This is clearly a false self way of operation. Because they're asking, I want to be sitting at the right and the right and the left hand of you when we come into the kingdom of God, when we enter heaven at some point. Who's going to sit on that right and on that left? Again, the false self looking for significance and power, prestige, gauging our value based on worldly success and importance. That's what's going on there with those disciples. But consider Jesus as a counter to that, living as a true person or living according to his true self as a beloved son of his Father. Consider Jesus on the cross. His ability to absorb the ridicule, his ability to absorb the scorn, right? His ability, in Matthew chapter 27, I won't read it, but when he's crucified and these rebels that he's crucified, they're ridiculing him. The guards are spitting on him, right? They're basically saying, you failed, right? You are not who you said you were. If you're really the king of the Jews, come down from that cross. But and if I'm in that case, what, Darren? Like if I was up on that cross and I had the power to do that, my fault, you can see, many of us probably could relate. Our false self might generate some things in us and say, you know what? I am going to stick it to you. I am going to come down, right? But look at what Jesus does. Jesus withstands that. He takes all of that onto himself. He doesn't need to respond because he's content in who he is as God is his Father. He is deeply loved by his Father. His focus in life is solely to do what God has called him to do. He's not impacted by the opinions of other people. His identity is not found in what somebody thinks about him. His identity is found on who he is as a child of God, deeply and deeply beloved as God being his Father. And so as we think about this context, looking at Jesus in this first point, that Jesus throughout his life was his own person. For us, in terms of our response, what does that look like for us to live holy lives in accordance and a replication to Jesus? Is that we live holy lives when we learn to live from our true self, which is a place of life, hope, and peace as a beloved child of God. Right? That's what it means to live a holy life. And we are not controlled by the forces of things around us that try to give us identity. We don't feel like we have to, say something or justify our opinion in order to be heard. Right? This is very upside down in our culture today, right? Especially in the culture of social media. Everybody can throw out an opinion there. Somebody argues with it. And then there's like a 45, response thread on all the people arguing back and forth about how you're right and I'm wrong, or I'm right and you're wrong, and all this stuff, right? We live in a society that's so focused on justifying ourselves, being heard and being right. And so to live holy is to learn to live from a place of life and hope and peace as a child of God, with an eye towards sacrifice, with an eye towards not needing to have the last word, not needing to be right, being okay with somebody saying something that is not true about you without feeling like you've got to, somehow prove the point that they're wrong. It's learning to live in that place, right? That's a hard thing. I'll just tell you, it's hard to live in that place. We all struggle with it. Another quote by Trevor Hudson, I'll share this with you. He says, "To be holy in a Christ-like way is in fact to become more truly ourselves. Holiness has little in common with Pharisaic rule-keeping, stuffy churchiness, and sterile ritual. But it has everything to do, if we take the example of Jesus seriously, with the glorious freedom of growing into our true selves and becoming the people that God has called us to be, that God wants us to be." There's a Hasidic tale, a Jewish tale that reinforces this idea. There's a rabbi his last name is Zusia. Rabbi Zusia arrived in heaven, and he was anxious about his degree of holiness. He wondered, well, would God reprimand him? He thought that God would be angry with him and question him about his way of life. Why did, God saying to him, why did you not become more like Moses or Solomon or David? This is what Rabbi Zusia thought. Instead, when God approached the rabbi, the question was very different. Tell me, why did you not become Rabbi Zusia? Why did you not fully become who I made you to be? Instead of trying to be somebody else. And a lot of our lives are spent doing that, trying to measure our identity against other people. Right? So to live a holy life is a life motivated and driven by love that lives in acceptance with the beauty that God has created in us to be as his people, and to relentlessly follow his call in our lives. That's a major component of this. A second way that Jesus models holiness is that Jesus gave himself to people and relationships. Jesus gave himself to people and relationships. Consider Jesus' continual interactions with people, teaching them, caring for them, healing them, and helping them. And it doesn't matter what their lot in life was. From the wealthy, powerful religious leaders like Nicodemus to the lepers on their deathbed and everybody in between. Jesus gave himself to people. He models and lives a holy and a different life by considering others better than himself, and giving himself away sacrificially. This is definitely different in our world today, isn't it? We don't see a lot of people living this way, out of sacrificial servanthood, giving themselves away for the sake of other people. Again, we too often try to maintain our own identities, right? Or our own comforts. And yet Jesus continually calls us to give that up, to give that away. Not because you're going to lose something important in response, but it's by giving up, it's by dying that we gain. We gain more of what God has called us to do. We gain more of what he desires to pour into our lives to replace that which we're giving up. And so our response is to be holy, is to become increasingly less self-centered and more concerned about needs around us. So if you want to model and replicate the holiness of Jesus in your life, I want to replicate the model of the holiness of Jesus in my life. One of the ways that I do that is I say, Darren, get off your high horse. Get down off your high horse and stop being so concerned about your own needs and be more concerned with the needs of those around you that Jesus brings in your path. Because friends, that's Jesus. That's how Jesus lived. And Jesus calls us to replicate what we see him do. And that's what he does. It's really, in some ways, as simple as that. The third way in which we see holiness lived out in the life of Jesus is that Jesus developed a close relationship with his Father. This is very, very important. Jesus is devoted to his Father. He knows him as Abba. He knows him as a loving Father. And doing the will of his Father is his highest aim in life. Remember, Garden of Gethsemane is a human being struggling with, he knows he's about to be betrayed. He knows that he's about to be, or he was betrayed, but he knows he's about to be handed over, to be brutally beaten and tortured, and then to be put on a cross to die, and all the baggage that came with that in terms of what image that would give of him to everybody around him, that he was actually a liar. He failed. Like all of that is what it would convey to people. And he's in the Garden of Gethsemane and he's dealing with this, right? And you can see him with the anguish as he prays to his Father. Father, is there any other way we can accomplish this thing? Because I'm not really looking forward to the next 48 hours, right? This is going to be brutal. But he always ends his prayer, not my will, but yours be done, right? He always models, and he addresses his concern. He addresses his needs, his concerns about what's going to happen. And you see his heart as a human being, right? But he always comes back to, I'm here for the purpose of doing what the Father's asked me to do. right? And our lives need to be we need to look at our lives through that lens as well. Like you and I, as followers of Jesus, have been called by Jesus to do the will of Jesus. Like it's not really an optional activity for us. Like it's not something we can just opt out and say, well, I don't want to do that. Or that's good, but that's not for me. That's for somebody else. We always want to look to the teachings of Jesus with an eye towards the fact that Jesus presumes and expects that my son, Darren, my daughter, fill in your name, my son, fill in your name, I have designed you to fulfill these things. I've designed you to live in this way, and I've modeled it for you. Oh, and by the way, I'm not going to leave you to your own human flesh to try to accomplish it, but instead, I'm actually going to send my spirit to actually infect you with the Holy Spirit virus, to live in you, to motivate you, and to encourage you, and to actually do the work, that which I'm calling you to do. Right? That's a beautiful thing. Like he just doesn't leave us on our own to try to figure it out and in our own strength. He says, no, I will be with you forever. Right? But he also won't fight for allegiance in our lives either. We've seen that. Maybe I'm the only one that's seen that in my own life, right? I can easily take control of my life as a follower of Jesus. And I start to see my fruit as a follower of Jesus diminish. I see my anxiety and my lack of peace increase. But the more I begin to relinquish control, the more I come back into a place of submissiveness before Jesus and say, your will be done, not mine, the more I find that I'm living in step with the life that Jesus called me to live. And again, that is not based on, look at Darren and all how good he is and all the things he does. It is based on Darren's life is trying to be more aligned to this agape, God-sized love that is growing and living within him, as is for all of us, right? And so a love can be a great indicator for us. If you don't find yourself growing in sacrificial, compassionate, unconditional love for all people at all times and in all situations, it is a picture, it is a sign that you and I are not fully formed, that the Spirit of God still has work to do in us, right? And that applies to all of us in here, because nobody in here is perfect, right? We all are on this journey with Jesus. I mean, some of us probably in different places, right? We're all in different spots, but we're all on this journey together. And that is a journey of divine love. It's a journey of God's love being fully developed and formed within us. So, our response, Jesus develops a closer relationship with his Father. And so our response is to be holy, is to learn to nurture our intimacy with God. Because if we don't learn this important step, our holiness, our being different, will never be fully realized. So we have to be with the Father to allow his love to be developed and manifest in us. That Jesus models this for us. He models it in how he spends time with his Father. He breaks away from the crowds. He spends time alone with his Father. I love the image of the great surgeon operating on him. You know, you think about it in your own life, operating on us daily, transforming us in his love in order for us to live a life of love. This is holiness. This is what it means to live different, holy lives. To be infused and infected by God's divine love that begins to pour out of us relentlessly around us. Too often we're so busy, right? We're so focused on all the other things going on in our lives that we lose space and time, and we're distracted by so many things. One day there was a harassed and busy executive that was on his way to his office when he spotted a Bedouin from the desert sitting and resting under a city park tree. The executive stopped and asked the Bedouin, "What are you doing here?" And the Bedouin said, "Well, as you can see, I've decided to stop for a while." The executive replied by saying, "You know, you could be earning money if you were working." The Bedouin replied, "Well, what would I do with it?" "Well, if you earned some money, you could open up an office." "Well, and then what?" "Well, then you could earn more money and build a factory." "Okay, well, then what?" "Well, then you could have your own villa in some fancy resort." "Oh, good, then what?" "Well, then you'd still have some money to be put into the bank." "Yes, and then?" "Well, then you could stop and sit down and rest." "But that's what I'm doing at the moment." Right? Sometimes we spend so much time getting to this point when you start there in the first place, right? Spending time alone with God, with Jesus, with the Spirit, Learning to be operated on by the great surgeon is key to being infected with God's divine love, to live a life that replicates the life of Jesus, a holy life. So with that, I want to challenge us and just encourage us this morning. I'm going to cut my stuff short here a bit today, but I want to challenge us as we think about holiness, as we think about God's holiness and our call to be holy. If there's anything that sticks with you, I want you to think less about rules and more about living and operating more out of a life of God's divine agape love. As we live a life of love, we are walking in step with the differentness, the holiness of Jesus. And it is seen and experienced not only in our own lives, but those around us. Jesus, we thank you for this truth and this reality. We thank you that you are perfect and holy and righteous and just. Thank you that you are different, that you are the embodiment of divine love. We know that we can't be holy like you are. We can't operate and live out of a place of divine love in all of our actions and interactions with people around us. But we know that there is hope for us that we can, by your Spirit working in us and moving in us. We don't understand how it all works, but we do know that we need to come before you continually to offer ourselves to you, to be controlled by you, to be worked on by you as the great surgeon. And so would you infect us more and more with your divine agape love? Would you lead us to respond in love in all situations to those around us, regardless of the circumstance? We need your help to do this. We're dependent on your Spirit to transform us in these ways. In Jesus' name, amen. All right.